This is the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. It's 5 years old this November. Hindsight has revealed this machine to have been a pretty poor choice compared to Apple Silicon laptops that released less than a year after it. But I think we're quick to forget how the 2019 MacBook Pros paved the way for the overwhelming success of Apple Silicon. Half a decade on, and there are several reasons why we will never see another MacBook like this one. Let's get the obvious out of the way first. This MacBook is based on x86 CPU architecture with an Intel i7 or i9 available on board. There's up to 64GB of DDR4 RAM and PCIe-based SSD storage that goes up to 8TB. Graphics go up to the AMD Pro 5600M with 8GB of dedicated video RAM. It's easy to sleep on the significance of these specs now, but let's not forget this is the most powerful Intel-based laptop Apple ever released, by some margin. 2019 was the only year we saw MacBooks reach 5GHz clock speeds, which can still compete fairly strongly in the world of x86 machines. We'll come back to the on-paper specs later, but what's so special about the physical design of the laptop? Well, the 2019 16-inch is actually 200 grams, or almost half a pound heavier than the 15-inch machines that came before it. It's also a little bit thicker. This might seem strange considering the tiresome pursuit of thinness Apple seems to have taken on over the last couple of decades, but the 16-inch is bigger for a reason. Yes, the screen is an inch bigger, but the extra size also helps sort out the terrible cooling MacBooks from 2016 to 19 had picked up a bit of a reputation for. This means less thermal throttling and loud fan noise. The slightly thicker chassis also gives the MacBook more space for a proper scissor switch keyboard. None of the rubbish we saw in those 2016 to 19 machines I mentioned. Those older MacBooks had used a butterfly keyboard mechanism which was far more prone to failure than on any previous Macs. It led to Apple losing a huge sum of money because of lawsuits against them. Yes, it did save a few millimeters in space due to the small movement required beneath the keys, but it was objectively a pretty poor trade-off considering how often those butterfly keyboards would fail. The 16-inch 2019 MacBook scissor switch keyboard is close to what many would consider the perfect laptop keyboard, and it's remained almost unchanged in every MacBook since. How else did the 16-inch 2019 Pro pave the way for future machines? Well, it brought in audio-visual improvements unseen until its release. The biggest MacBook Apple sold during the 20-teens was 15 inches, until the 16-inch came along. The bigger screen has a resolution of 3072 by 1920, which is truly great, even 5 years later. Seriously, try comparing this to any Windows laptop's display, and even the newer Apple ones. Yes, there's no ProMotion 120Hz technology, meaning it is limited to 60Hz, but other than that, it's a truly great display. Oh, and let's not forget, the 16-inch 2019 model is the last of the 16-inch MacBooks with no display notch. That notch just does my head in on newer machines because it's a bit jarring when you're viewing content in full screen. So while we're talking about audio-visual stuff, let me point out this MacBook Pro was a serious step up in speaker quality from the 15-inch models that came before it. A 6-speaker Dolby Atmos supported setup inside the thing brings out a level of sound you really don't expect to hear from such a thin device. Without showing you one in person, the best way I can describe it is it's like the MacBook has speakers set up all around you. There's more bass than you'd expect too, far more than on 13-inch laptops released in 2019. This speaker setup built a strong foundation for those we've seen on MacBook Pros from 2019 through to now. Newer MacBook Pros are actually thicker than this 16-inch model, so it's ever more impressive that such a setup could be put to work inside this thing. Again, I'd like to see any Windows laptop compete with speakers like these, even in 2024 and beyond. Right, so there will never be another MacBook like this one, in part because of the Intel chip inside of it. There's other reasons though. Apple hasn't made another 16-inch MacBook with a touch bar since the release of the 2019. Support for the touch bar will likely be written out of macOS a few years down the line, and that's music to the ears of many who would far prefer having simple function keys at the top of the keyboard. But I, along with many others, don't think the touch bar was such a bad thing. Volume and brightness adjustment can be done with a simple drag left or right. Better, I think, than having to press or hold a button repeatedly. The touch bar changes depending on what's on your screen, too. Browsing the web is just different on these Touch Bar Macs, and so is using software like Final Cut or Logic. MacBooks leading up to the 2019 had pretty poor Touch Bar implementation. The escape key was part of the Touch Bar, so wouldn't always show up at the right time. That was especially unpopular, which is pretty understandable. The 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro had a separate physical escape key though. The fingerprint reader and power button was separate from the bar too. Nice symmetry going on, and all in the name of functionality, really. Despite the improvements to the Touch Bar, Apple did drop it from the 13-inch MacBook Pros in 2023. It didn't appear on any 16-inch Pros after 2021. We do still have the fingerprint reader across the board though. Overall, I'm not too fussed, but thought the Touch Bar was novel, pretty useful, and pretty interesting looking. Enough talk about stats and about dates though. How does this thing actually perform? Well, unfortunately, heat has been an issue in the 2019 MacBook Pros from the very beginning. It's not as bad on the 16-inch, as, like I said, it's slightly thicker than the previous models. The fans still spin more than would be convenient for most though. Browsing the web is mostly fine, and so is doing things like writing documents and opening photos. These are the basics in terms of computer usage, and you wouldn't expect it to be too taxing for the laptop. Doing things like video editing, or even just opening a couple of photos in Photoshop does make the fan spin up though, almost without failure. The noise is annoying, to say the least. I actually made some of my first YouTube videos on a 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro, and it used to drive me up the wall that the MacBook itself couldn't keep quiet during the recording I was working with at the time. Fan noise is all but a thing of the past on more modern MacBooks. Apple Silicon has a lower power draw versus 2019 Intel chips, leading to a lot less heat in general. It's worth noting that although the heat and noise is problematic, the 2019 16-inch is pretty capable for modern tasks. The i7 version has 6 cores clocking at 2.6 to 4.5 GHz, while the top spec i9 model has 8 cores which go from 2.4 to 5 GHz. Creative apps like Logic, Final Cut, and Photoshop might heat the laptop up, but it does offer a smooth performance beyond pretty much any Intel MacBook the world ever saw. Does this compete with Apple Silicon? No. Benchmark data does back me up here. But if you're not editing big videos, not doing crazy 3D renders, and not a professional photographer with thousands of photos to open at once, this machine should see you through. One interesting use case for this machine not too many people talk about is gaming. In a way, this is the ultimate MacBook for gaming on. The dedicated graphics on board make light work of most games released up to 2019 and will run pretty much anything as long as you're happy to turn down graphics settings on some games. Crazy as it seems, I was able to run Cyberpunk 2077 with a playable frame rate on my 2019 16-inch. Native Windows support using Apple's Boot Camp utility comes in clutch here. Windows 10 can be booted fine from the internal SSD and runs as it would on a Windows laptop once the drivers are sorted out. M1 and later MacBooks cannot run Windows natively because Apple no longer uses Intel x86 processors in their computers, which is what Boot Camp was written for. Let's talk about pricing now. The used market for 2019 16-inch MacBook Pros is crazy right now. If you sort by auctions ending soonest on eBay, you might just find yourself a crazy deal. At release, these things started at $2,400, but I've seen some go for $400 and something recently. Should you buy one? Well, that's up to you. But if you have $500 to spend on a Mac, I'd suggest putting your money into an M1 machine for a longer lifespan, as well as objectively better performance. Windows 10 and 11 won't run as well on an Apple Silicon Mac, as you'll have to use a virtual machine setup. If you are after a Mac for gaming or for Windows though, I'd point you in the direction of a Windows desktop or even a Windows laptop. The price will be lower and the machine will be built for playing games in Windows. So while I cannot recommend you buy one today, the MacBook Pro 2019 16-inch remains a very unique machine. It's safe to say we probably won't see another like it. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you especially to Adrian, Oliver Wilderman, Penny, Kinda Average Tech, and James from 4.5 Giraffes. Supporting me on Patreon goes a long way to improving content on this channel.